This show is brought to you by Safety FM.
Hi listeners, this is Brent Sutton. Welcome to episode 6 of the Practice of Learning Teams. Today we'll be conducting a mini learning team with my colleagues Brent Robinson and Glynis McCarthy. In today's mini learning team, we'll be talking about extending the notion of work as imagined and work as done as being more than just the black line, blue line, and then looking for learning opportunities on the pathway.
In most organisations, we talk about work, and when you're leading an organisation, you get to realise that at some stage it's work as imagined. We come up with a range of procedures and policies, and it's the way that in the office we quite often think about how work is getting done out in the field. And it's really important to understand that that is how we think it's happening, and as we need to move through each one of these stages, we need to develop our learning along the way to where work is actually done. So that's going to be the conversation that we're going to broaden out today.
And I think the fact that we need to prescribe work as imagined is actually not wrong. You know, there is a practical need to imagine or to think about how work should be done.
Yeah, we when we're starting off a project, we need to understand what that actually looks like,
Absolutely.
Where it's coming from,
And creating it is really important when we're trying to plan or implement new processes, new systems, lay out plant and equipment. If we're trying to schedule operations or activities around resources and demands, doing upgrades, maintenance, or even just basic improvements around safety as the result of a review. So I think work as imagined is fundamentally important to have that, because that's where we start from. That's our frame.
Yeah, I agree, Brenda. It's our starting point for all organisations.
It's also a duty of care from the organisation's point of view that they have thought about how a task or activity is going to be done in such a way that people are not going to be harmed. So that's your starting point, isn't it?
And I think from a visual point of view, the way that work is imagined and work is done is being sort of shown, it basically infers that there's a sudden change that happens between work as imagined and as work is done. Or what we're basically trying to provide some transparency about is that it actually changes as it moves through parts of the different parts of the organisation. That how people see risk changes as it moves through the organisation. Yep. And more importantly, that view of risk also changes where organisations are forming part of a supply chain or a contract chain as well.
So really what you're saying there, Brent, is it's multifaceted.
It is. So it just doesn't shift from one to another. It actually changes as it goes. And I've been struggling to use some words to express that change. Originally I was saying that risk evolves or devolves as it goes through the organisation, because it's about those different perspectives. Because when we talk about the blue line, black line, we sort of show like a sort of a curve going up and then coming back under and going back up and back under. I suppose that difference between above the line and below the line is the same thing as saying that the risk evolves or devolves through that time, rather than saying it starts at the top and it ends at the bottom at the end. In actual fact, It's actually flowing. It's changing as it moves through it.
And so you're saying that it's changing based on changes within the organisation or changes in the daily work and as people are adapting? Or you're also talking about how it's the way people see it as perceived, as that it's changing and it's evolving or de-evolving during that over a time period between those different sections.
It's changing because of those couplings that Todd will talk about.
Yeah.
Those things that are influencing both the hazard and those things that are influencing the person and the environment and it's all those couplings which are really hard to visually create because they have so much interdependency on each other.
And I think that's important when we're talking about work as imagined, that when you're imagining how the work will be done, you won't have that context around those changes or those couplings. You're effectively thinking about it in quite a pure way. This is the way we hope it's going to happen.
Yeah, very much in an abstract way, isn't it?
Yes.
Without that full understanding of the context. And don't forget, the context can often change in a very small way over time, or it could change in quite a radical way over time. But certainly there is a learning that takes place. Once you apply your thoughts, so once you take work as imagined and start to apply, actually there's a whole lot of learning that takes place around all of that minutiae about how you go about doing something.
So as part of this podcast, we'll be releasing a diagram which basically looks at that how that risk ebbs and flows. I think ebbs and flows is quite useful.
It's a nice way to think of it.
Yeah, so how risk ebbs and flows as it moves through the organisations. And we've defined that as 4 categories. And we've defined those things as a flow, as a linear process. Why don't we explore some of those as a team? I think it's quite really useful. So I might kick off. We start off with good old work as imagined. And work as imagined is how the organisation states how the hazard, and the activities that we do are to be carried out. And this information is found in our systems, and the organisation ultimately has to accept through its risk assessment process whether it finds the risk associated with work as imagined to be acceptable or unacceptable, or they have to tolerate. But what's that next flow? So after we have work as imagined, how we plan or we perceive things, how does that flow down? What's that next phase? What are your thoughts, Brent Robinson?
Well, it's really work as thought as we start moving through the organisation. It's how management thinks about those hazards and risks within that work and activity. And really it's now starting to change a little bit, isn't it? It's over here we had the very pure, this is how work is done. And then work as thought is in the middle. It's one of the middle sections, so like management's getting feedback about what's happening out in the field or out on the shop floor or wherever it might be happening. And that's changing the organisation's view. So they've now got a view around work as thought. This is what we think is happening. So it's changed from how we imagined it was going to be to how we think it is. We're still not down the other end there. The next part of it's going to be work as disclosed or work as reported. And I think that's where, team leaders and supervisors or subcontractors are effectively saying, well, this is... we're telling you this is how we're doing the work. And sometimes I think that can be, they're telling a story of how they want they're trying to tell the organisation or the management team what they want to hear. And, I think it's really important as we move down this that we understand that there's those things there. And at this, and Glynis has talked about this quite a bit around building that trust up between these sections.
So that's a bit like the fact that work as disclosed or work as reported basically means that that group of individuals, they're having to live with what they can do.
Yes.
In other words, the organisation has espoused what they think good looks like. And then the people within that work as disclosed or work as reported, they're now having to actually carry that out based on the demands and the constraints and the capacities of that work that potentially work as imagined or work as thought didn't actually know about or couldn't actually cater for at the time.
Yeah.
And this is often how people actually talk about the work that they do. So this is the language that they use to talk about those things that either support good practice or become barriers to good practice.
I think, what we've got to get to here is, it's really understanding what we're being told at this point. If we're, in that leadership position or we're trying to critique the system and understand where people are at, this is a really important part of it. But again, it really gets to the next point, which is with the people doing the tasks, work is done, finding out what they're doing and what constraints they're having to deal with, how they're having to adapt to situations, how, things are actually happening in the field, on the ground, wherever they happen to be doing that work. And it's, Brent, you've talked about it before, but it's like that game, Chinese Whispers, right? You start at one end, you get to the other end, and you might start saying A at this end. When you get to the other end, it might be T. And I think that's a really good way to characterize what we're talking about here. And how do we adapt to that, and how do we feed back through the organization and improve, because it's about improvement at this point, isn't it?
Look, it is. And I think the Chinese Whispers game, or also commonly referred to as the telephone game, is a really good example for people in a leadership position to actually see the fact that communications does vary as it moves through the organisation.
Yeah.
Therefore, if communications vary as it moves through the organisation, then surely risk has to change at the same time.
Absolutely, and often that communication channel is one directional. So it goes from workers imagined through workers thought, through workers disclosed or reported on, to workers done. And often those people at a leadership level don't actually know how work is done until something goes wrong.
Yeah,
and
I think it's top down, isn't it? We're pushing workers imagined down to workers done, thinking that we've done as leaders or managers, we've done our job. We've given them the rules to play by, without understanding what the game is necessarily.
So we've told them what's expected of them.
Yes, and without, in lean they'll talk about going to the Gimba, and it's really important. If you're not going out there to have a look at what's going on, and it's not about auditing, it's not about any of those things. It's about understanding that what those people are having to do on the ground.
And you only get that through conversation. If you just go out and observe practice, actually, typically when someone comes out to observe your practice, you do it perfectly.
Yes.
What you really want to know is that those things that underpin good practice. And you can only get to that by talking to people where work is done.
So one of the reasons why we wanted to show how this risk changes, or how this risk ebbs and flows, was to basically really say that there are some learning opportunities that can be had as risk moves through the organisation, or as risk moves through the supply chain or the contract chain. Because it's as humans, we love a linear process because it makes us easy to follow. But in reality, it's not a linear process. And I think, Glynis, you came up with something that was quite fascinating about how to represent that slightly differently.
Yeah, well, we've bandied about a few different ideas, haven't we? So we've talked about, we've talked about lines, we've talked about intersecting lines, we've talked about, say, Venn diagrams where you have circles that intersect with one another. But I think a good way to represent this is with concentric circles. So if we put work at the heart of our first circle, then what sits most closely to it is work is done. And then that sits up against work is disclosed or work is reported, how people talk about that work, which is supported with how we think about work, so work is thought. So those are your policies and your procedures, which in turn should be reflective how work is imagined. And if we have circles that are of unequal diameter, actually it all starts to fall apart. Yeah, they need to go from small to large, and they need to be equally spaced. And without that, we get a bit of a disconnect.
So I think a lot of organisations try and talk about how do we stop that risk from ebbing and flowing through the organisation. Whereas I think what we're trying to say is that's normal.
Yep.
But it has to ebb and flow.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it has to ebb and flow. And what we need to be doing from a leadership point of view is making sure that ebb and flow isn't too large.
Right.
That we can cope with that ebbing and flowing, that our systems are supporting good practice.
Yeah.
They're not acting as a barrier.
What we're saying here is our systems can't be brittle. They need to be able to large enough, or robust, not large enough, but robust enough to let that ebb and flow happen, because it's naturally going to happen. And that ebb and flow, hopefully, fits within the system that we've built around it.
Right. And therefore, those opportunities for learning happen at those points. Is that what we're basically saying? That we should be looking to get those learning opportunities as risk ebbs and flows, as it moves through the organisation or through the supply chain or through the contracting chain.
Yeah, and I think I like that idea, because what I like about it is, as you're learning, you're making your system more robust, and that to me seems to make a lot of sense. We're building that robustness, and from that learning opportunity that we've created.
It also follows the PDCA model. That we're doing continuous improvement. That we don't think that just because we've imagined something, that's going to be perfectly and entirely implemented, and that there will never be a variation. So I think that we have to build into our systems opportunities for us to review at those critical points. And those critical points are as we move out of those zones. So as we move from work as imagined into work as thought, making sure that they're closely aligned. As we move from work as thought as to work as disclosed or reported about, that there's some alignment there between what we are saying and writing often versus what are we saying in terms of how do people talk about the work that they do. And then some evidence that work is done is in line with work as disclosed, as work as thought, as work as imagined.
I think there's some real power there, isn't there? That, back to your point about continuous improvement, that learning opportunity actually creates that opportunity for some continuous improvement. And, PDCA is a great way to describe it. It's a 50-year-old process. There's nothing new about it. It's older than 50 years. But there's nothing new about it, but we're using that to improve those systems of work.
Absolutely, and Brent's talked a couple of times now where the PDCA model, I suppose, has sort of morphed over time. So it started off as the PDSA.
Yes.
There was a period in there where we studied, but actually I think that what we do often is that we do check, but we don't do check deep enough. So for me, study is about really having an understanding of kind of nuance. Checking to me is kind of going with a form and ticking things off.
Yeah, I think check has been replaced by audit, and you're not doing it right. You're not doing it right, and we're not taking that opportunity to say, well, plan, do, check. We need to make a change here. The system isn't as good as it could be, or we can learn something here, and then we can take that learning opportunity and come around again. And continuous improvement, is a step up each time. We're improving the system. It's an incremental small step each time. And I think you're 100% right that if we just stop at check, we're not going to learn anything. We have to be able to fulfill that circle.
It just reminded me that that's actually reinforced in ISO 45001, the International Standard for Health and Safety, where it talks about that you need to identify the opportunities for improvement.
Yeah.
And I think businesses have lost the fact that it's about understanding, looking for the opportunities for improvement. Where do they sit? Where do they exist?
Yep.
And I love a classic one from Dr. Todd, where he talks about, remember that we are managing uncertain outcomes with certain controls, and that we need to use that PDCA model of improvement, because we need to identify the opportunities for improvement to support the management of those uncertain outcomes with certain controls. Because that's what we're doing. Because at the end of the day, the only person who is exposed to the risk is the worker.
Yep.
And it's the responsibility of the organisation to try and make that worker as successful as possible by having controls that will provide those safe outcomes for the worker to begin with. In that way. So I think what's quite interesting, I think you had a really good example, Brent Robinson, about COVID-19 in the state of Victoria in Australia.
Yeah, we're living it at the moment where, what's happened is that the government and the departments have effectively put in the system, work as imagined, we're going to do hotel quarantine and it's going to work like this. And then they've put in all sorts of processes to do that. But then it got down to, workers thought, and they've subcontracted it, and subcontractors are doing workers disclosed, and workers reported back up the chain and down the chain. But it looks like that nobody has actually been able to report back or have reported back work is done. And, back to what Glynis was saying before about PDCA, we're not checking, we're not acting, we're not going around through the circle again. And I think that's going to be, we're living that particular problem at the moment. The whole of Victoria has felt it. We've gone from, I think the numbers were in wave 1, we had 12 deaths. We will sadly pass through 800 deaths in the next day or so. I think that's a epic failure of a system. People want to blame people and hold people accountable, but really what it's saying is in unprecedented times that our systems were incredibly brittle, and we weren't going back and improving them. We didn't take those opportunities to learn. And I think it's a great example moving forward.
Some people would basically claim that there was no time to do that. They're saying that they were, time poor. I heard an example the other day which basically said people weren't given sufficient time to train. So how could we ask them to do something if we didn't give them training? I'm not convinced that a virus knows about time.
No. Or whether the person's trained.
Yeah, the virus...
Or the prequel's been up to standard.
Yeah. Or that the font type of the SOP looks good.
Yes.
And I think this is a classic example that we're dealing with a well-known hazard being a virus. But this particular strain of virus has a whole lot of dynamic nature that we didn't know about before.
And it's adapting.
And it's changing.
But I think if you look at the way that risk has been managed, and we go back to that notion of concentric circles, here you have an example where workers imagined as this enormous circle. But actually, workers thought about, workers disclosed or workers reported, and definitely workers done, actually they're minute in relation to that massive circle. And that's why you have this huge disconnect. It doesn't take time, or it doesn't take a great deal of time, but it does take meaningful conversations to be had to bring those 4 things back in line. And I think, Victoria is a really good example of where a mandate was put forward. This is what we're going to do. But actually there wasn't enough emphasis placed on making sure that how work was thought about was in line with how it was imagined. And certainly not enough thought was put down to how work was reported or disclosed about. And certainly not enough was done around how work is done. So all of those circles became completely out of kilter.
Yeah, and and we're left with what we've been left with, and it's going to affect people for many years to come. If you exclude the poor people that have lost loved ones, the people that have lost their jobs and the economic damage is done, and it comes back to a system. And back to that point is workers imagined and workers done. They were wildly different.
Yet the inquiries that are being undertaken are still based on blame.
Yes.
Rather than based on learning. They're based on retribution rather than actually looking at the restorative process, particularly when this virus has not been eliminated, has not been eradicated, is something that we have to live with for another period of time, which is yet to be determined. I was being reminded just recently that the recent flu shot that I had has elements of viruses going back to the Spanish flu with H1N1. That these viruses don't disappear.
No, they're at low levels in the community.
There's always low levels, absolutely. So I think, like everything else, we should look at this as being a learning opportunity and asking ourselves the question, how do we make our systems more resilient so that we can, I think what you're saying, Glynis, allow risk to ebb and flow through the organisation, but not allow it to break the system.
Very much so. Well put.
Well, I think you made a really interesting comment there about that it is, when we're talking about work as imagined and work as done, is that if you get into that retributive type of justice that we're seeing in Victoria at the moment, work is reported, you won't get what you're looking for. And so it's important that you have a conversation, and you can have conversations where there is some trust in it, that people can tell you how it's going, and you can adjust work as imagined and work as thought and bring those things closer together. And, to Glynis's concentric circles, it's not one huge one with a couple of dots in the middle, that they're much more closely aligned. And I think, it's a great example that we can learn from for many years to come.
And I think what we need to do is look for opportunities for learning. I think we need to look for opportunities for workers to gain learning and gain understanding, and we need to look for opportunities for the organisation to gain learning and to gain understanding. Right.
And our new phrase for the day is that we need to keep learning and improving to reduce uncertainty. Thank you, listeners, for being part of this podcast. We'd love to hear your learnings from today or other topics you would like us to support you on. Go to www.podcastlearnings.com and be part of the community practice of learning teams at www.learningteamscommunity.com.
The views and opinions expressed on this podcast are those of the host and its guest and do not necessarily reflect the official policy or position of the company. Examples of analysis discussed within this podcast are only examples. They should not be utilized in the real world as the only solution available, as they are based only on very limited and dated open source information. Assumptions made within this analysis are not reflective of the position of the company. No part of this podcast may be reproduced, stored in a retrieval system, or transmitted in any form or by any means, mechanical, electronic, recording, or otherwise, without prior written permission of the creator of the podcast, Jay Allen.